Buongiorno tutti. Very happy to be here. So I represent the World Bank. It's of course a very big organization. We have 50,000 people everywhere in the world working only in developing countries. And today I'll present a little bit more on what we've been doing on renewable energy. We've been promoting renewable energy for quite some time now, thinking about ways to attract private investors. Because the problem is there's limited amount of public funding. And from the public branch of the World Bank Group, my client is the government. What I'm supposed to do is help them try to figure out how to use best their funding. And by doing that, we're trying to have the right private investors, the right partners for 25 years. Because we're signing power purchase agreement for quite some time with investors that they're going to select. And we need to have, hence, in this case, advisory support, which we're providing to actually select the right partners. So a few years back, we've been thinking about what do we need to look at, which kind of challenges are inhibiting private investors to actually be there and actually join the partnership of renewable energy in Liberia, in Central African Republic, in Indonesia. And so we did a little market sounding asking, what is happening? Why are you not coming to all these countries? The first problem that was being mentioned at 95% of taker risk. The utilities, the state utilities that are signing those power purchase agreements are usually not bankable. And you need a bankable partner to actually sign a contract for 25 years, where you're putting hundreds of millions of dollars of capex on the table. Second problem, legal. If you don't have the right legal framework, what do? How can you do recourse on your contract that you have signed if the legal framework is not in place? The expertise of the counterpart, mostly on procurement, major problems of actually launching procurement processes. Mostly you end up doing bilateral deals, under the table, a lot of corruption, if I can say, is actually really happening. And the problem is that if you don't have visibility on a tender, on a program, why would you go there? You're probably going to spend 5, 10 years trying to negotiate some contract with that government and probably never even going to have a contract signed at the end. And then there are a bit more systematic problems such as grid. So on that, renewable energy is, in particular, wind and solar, being variable generation, is a major problem because you have grid instability already in those grids. Like when I'm speaking about Liberia or Central African Republic, the grids are extremely weak. When you're connected to the grid, today you have 2, 3, 4 hours of electricity. You have a lot of load shading, which means you have a lot of issues with the lights that are flickering. And so the problem is that with this type of grid already, if you connect on top of that some variable generation, which is solar and wind, honestly, your grid will probably collapse because the grid is just not made for that. And then the last problem that was really a critical one was land. And here we have multiple issues from land tenures, problems of actually not having, again, back to the legal framework. You don't actually have the right legal framework to actually get the right land tenure agreement, or even land availability. We're working on small island states. Look at the Maldives. Where is land? There is none. So what do you do? So we've been working, I had actually added this slide, I forgot about this one. I'm adding another big problem, which wasn't actually mentioned when we did the analysis 4 or 5 years ago, is the current issues on disruption of supply chain. And today you have major cost increase that we're not expecting, mostly because of COVID, Chinese issues, the problem of polysilicon, which is being produced mostly in China, and the war in Ukraine, which, unfortunately, for example, when you think about a substation, which is an absolutely critical piece to your power plant, it happens that most of the production of transformers is actually between Ukraine, Russia, and Belarus. So it's a little bit unfortunate because we absolutely need this piece of equipment, which is actually now focused on zones that are in conflict. And so that actually is leading us to also think a bit more about what can we do to actually not be as linked to certain zones or certain countries, but rethink it a bit the supply chain, which is today a real bottleneck for any future deployment of solar and wind. So linked to that, we've been really thinking about what can we do. Again, from the government's perspective, we're here to support clients to think about how to actually make sense of all these issues. What can you do to do that? And we've been working with a few other MDBs on developing this Sustainable Renewables Risk Mitigation Initiative. Sorry, it's a horrible name. So the acronym is much easier, SRMI. And we have 4 blocks, as you can see. Actually, it's 5 now, but it's a bit complex to understand like that. But we're focusing on the enabling environment, thinking about upstream support. So what do you need today on plans? They usually don't have the right plans. Simply, you look for a plan in renewables in Burkina Faso, they simply don't have it. They're saying, yes, in my NDC, I want to do 60, 70% solar. That's great. But what does it concretely mean? You have great targets. Where's the plan? Where's the actual plan that you can implement? And that's what we're looking for, implementable plans that we can put money in. Second point is, then you have this plan. You have those great targets. You need to actually procure these plans. You need to actually find the right investors for that. That's the second roadblock, downstream support on technical assistance. Third roadblock, the public investment in the grid. As I just said, major problems in the grid. The grids are just not strong enough. And on that, you have to have public investments. So for that, the bank and most of the MDBs present are actually funding grid upgrades to allow for this integration of variable generation. It can also include battery storage, pump storage, all of those enablers to allow for better integration of variable generation. And the last roadblock is on risk mitigation. Once you're actually able to launch bankable tenders, you have the right instrument in place, you have probably a little less curtailment that you believe you're going to have, you still have usually residual risk. The off-taker is still not bankable, even though we're making the contract bankable. And so you need to have the right guarantee products to actually allow for the investor to believe that there will be enough liquidity, for example. Most of the time, you believe that you're probably not going to have a terminated contract after 5 years, except if potentially there's a major problem, a political risk, there's a coup d'etat or something like that. But that's actually quite rare. The real problem that you're usually facing is liquidity within the utility. You need the utility to be able to have the running funds to pay you. And it's not even that much. It's usually a few $1 million per month that they're going to pay you. But most of the time, they don't have that cash. And so we have to be able to provide the right instrument to cover that risk as well. And in this case, we're providing a guarantee, which is a World Bank guarantee or another MTB guarantee that would cover that risk. We're also thinking about how to catalyze socioeconomic development. Going into a new country, coming in with your own workers, coming in with equipment from outside is a no-go. You need to also be able to say, yes, we're partnering here with you, government, not just to actually bring you power, but also actually bring development to your country, bring job creation, support a change in the sector that we're actually partnering together. And for that, we have multiple aspects based on really thinking about what are the comparative advantage of that country. It's usually more at the maintenance level, operation level, but in any case, it's really important to think about how the IPPs, the private investors, can actually join a partnership with the government during that long time of 25 years the PPA is. So we are usually going into new countries. We're working right now in over 55 countries, mostly in sub-Saharan Africa. And we come in usually saying, these are the questions that you need to think of. And they're all very much tailored to each issues that they're facing. And the real point is you need to have the right targets. How much VRE can you integrate? Where is it needed? When is it needed? Who do you want to attract? Which kind of investors do you want to attract? And how do you mitigate the risks that are left at the end? We are proposing a few risk mitigation instruments as well, which, as I mentioned, link to the bankability of the off-taker, thinking about mostly the issue on liquidity, the foreign exchange, that's another issue. Mostly your PPAs will be signed in local currency, but pegged or indexed to US dollar or euro. But sometimes you don't have enough funds in the central bank for that. So we're working, for example, in Ethiopia right now on developing a revolving foreign exchange fund to actually enable those IPPs to ensure that they will be paid in dollars at the end of the day. And then we're also working on mini-grids and how to ensure that green mini-grids can actually attract private investors. Because today, if you look at the mini-grid space, it's mostly publicly led. Very little private investments has been put into mini-grids, especially large mini-grids. And the reason for that is usually that, you're building a mini-grid, 20 years, you're actually going to size it for a demand that you assume you're going to have probably in 10 years, because you're not going to add a few solar panels every year. So the issue is there's a mismatch between the type of sizing that you want to have and what you will really have as demand. So here we are actually been working with the Green Climate Fund, the GCF, in DRC, to develop a demand risk facility, which is a viability gap funding, looking into the gap between what is being assumed in the business plan of the mini-grid and what is really happening. So we have grant funding that would be covering the difference until the point where we're back on track with the actual demand of those mini-grid providers. And that is really a key factor, because we're about to launch this mini-grid program, which is around 200 megawatt of mini-grid program for connecting around 6 million people in DRC. It's a very big program for us. And it actually seems like it's working. Like, we have huge interest by the private sector, and it's really focusing on the main issues. I'll now present 3 different examples from Vietnam, Indonesia, and Burkina Faso that we've been leading on for the last few years. And they all have very different issues that we've been trying to tackle. So Vietnam has around 62 gigawatt of power, in addition to another 10 gigawatt of rooftop PV, of which you have an enormous amount of solar in there. The issue, though, is that even though everybody has been saying, wow, Vietnam, incredible, 20 gigawatt of solar in less than a year, fantastic. Yeah, well, reality is 35 to 40% of actual generation produced by those plants is being curtailed, not being dispatched. Imagine, you're the private investor that signed this contract, you're not able to dispatch. And the contract is very smart. It's not to take or pay, it's to take and pay. So you basically have those kilowatt hours of solar being produced that are just being put into the earth and never being used. And that's a policy problem. That is generally a policy problem. It's not a problem of the investors were there. The problem was the government of Vietnam didn't indicate where it should have been on the grid, where they had space, where the investors should connect. And hence now they're thinking about a new way, which is indeed to launch a tender with those indications on the grid on where they could actually do it. And it's an important lessons learned from all of us on this one, because from the planning stage, we need to think about it. It cannot be, we're launching a tender, we'll let the IPP decide, and then we'll figure it out. Because that's basically what's been happening. Now, they're coming to us with an emergency grid program saying we absolutely need $800 million of investment in the grid to integrate those projects, because we can't actually continue having 40% of this generation getting curtailed. But if you would have done it in the right way, those $800 million wouldn't have been needed. So here, it's really important for us to really work really upstream with our clients on what is to be done before launching a tender. It's always very sexy to launch a tender, have great results, but the reality on the ground is we are speaking with the local state utilities, and they're saying, what the heck? What am I doing with that? How am I supposed to manage this thing? I've had great results. I've been having 10 years with zero curtailment, zero problem on the grid. And now actually because of all this generation, I'm going to end up with my clients at the distribution level with shading, lights flickering. And this is not a possibility. I can't have a great service, everybody saying that the utility is best, and then now I'm actually going downhill. So actually the result is they're saying, no, not anymore, cut. We go back to coal and gas, much easier. And of course that's not what we want. Next example, Indonesia. Indonesia has very different issues. We have 17,000 islands, 270 million people, a lot of coal and a lot of gas, one of the larger producers of coal in the world. Hence, one of the largest pipeline of coal in the world, coal power plants. What do you do with that? It's very hard to speak to a client when they're saying, well, first of all, have jobs. Like it represents in some regions 50% of my job workforce in the coal mines, in the coal power plants. And then it's one of my largest inputs into financing, into my GDP. And it's also the cheapest way to produce electricity in my country. What do you do with that? So then we've been trying to work really with them, at least starting on the plans in the Eastern Islands. So the islands that are more east, so not Java, which is the main islands where they have way too much coal. They already have way too much production. There's excess generation of around 40%. So honestly, they don't actually need more power. They'll start needing more power in a few years, and we're thinking about that. But we're working with PLN, the state utility, on that first. Thinking again, start with plans, and then getting funding to actually pay for it. And very interestingly, in the medium-sized islands, such as Sumbawa Island, we worked on the plan that PLN, the state utility, has. And we did a new least cost plan. So here I'm not trying to do net zero, which doesn't speak to anyone except the people at the COP. We're actually looking at concretely, is there a plan that actually can make you gain money, benefit from a new plan? We actually came saying, okay, we're not here to try to promote renewables because we know this is not exactly what you want. So we'll let the tool decide. We're not going to push anything into the tool. But we're going to revise the inputs that you're putting in, because the issue is that in those smaller islands, they were putting the same prices for coal than in the large grid. The problem is it's not exactly the same price when you do a gigawatt coal plant or a 15 megawatt coal plant. You're going from 3-4 cents to over 15 per kilowatt hour. The problem is, of course, you put these inputs into your plan. What happens? No, they come out. And so we had loads of small coal plants all across those islands. And so we told them, okay, let's work on it very honestly, putting the right inputs in. And that's the difference. No coal anymore, all solar. And all of that, they were getting around 9 cents per kilowatt hour reduction in the average generation cost between those two plants after 5 years of actually change in the plan. And so that actually really spoke to the Indonesians. We worked with them on a new plan, and they went from a gigawatt of coal across all of these islands to around 50, which was what they were building anyways, and from 5 megawatt of solar to over 2 gigawatt. And so we're actually now supporting them in launching the tender for these projects. And sorry, because I know I'm actually being very late and I spoke too much and I'm probably boring you. But my last example is Burkina Faso. Again, another very different example where we have a country which is mostly being powered by HFO, heavy fuel oil, and diesel, and have some imports. The cost of generation is enormous. And they have, on top of having power cost, which is around just on generation, around 35 cents. Thank God for the imports from Côte d'Ivoire and Ghana, which is reducing quite drastically the average cost. But they also have only, 20% of electrification. People are not connected to the grid. You have mines that are though getting power or having their own generation, which is also HFO. So basically everybody's doing HFO. And the problem is with an HFO in Burkina Faso, it takes 4 days to bring the HFO from the port of Côte d'Ivoire up to Burkina. And in the middle of that, you have multiple coups d'etat and you have major issues. So what do? We need to move into solar and battery. And there, we've been doing a lot of work with them. And we have now a new tender that we're about to launch for 300 megawatt of PV with the first phase, which is 120, with a major amount of battery storage. That together is allowing the penetration of solar in Burkina Faso to be one of the largest in the world. We would end up with over 40% of actual generation, which is solar-based, and reducing drastically that cost. And that's really important to think about that, because it's also important to have the right partners in, but also have the possibility to not be dependent on other countries and really use the fact that they have so much space, in particular in the northern regions, closer to the Sahel, where you can actually really utilize that space and actually have very cheap production of solar power. We're then supporting them into having CTF funding. In that case, we got Clean Technology Fund funding. It's a $200 million investment. And we are then funding the land, the permitting, the evacuation line. We're also putting quite a bit of funding in grid network. That's the last one. And the IPPs would be putting around $350 million of investments. So here we go. I'm done. Sorry. Thank you.